Hey friends, it's me, Miss Jenny. Here we are, the last chapter of Henry in the Clubhouse. I think we're going to get it finished today. Are you excited? I am. All right, so where we left off was that Henry had written a letter to Sheriff Bud, trying to get Sheriff Bud to tell Ramona to quit being a pest. So let's find out if he read it on TV. 2 days later, Henry rang the Quimby's doorbell about the time the Sheriff Bud program was starting. "Hello, Beezus," he said when his friend opened the door. "I was wondering, how about a game of checkers before I start my paper route?" Beezus looked surprised. She and Henry used to play checkers often, but since he'd become a paper carrier and spent so much time working on the clubhouse, he'd not found time to play with her. "Why, yes, come on in." As Henry expected, Ramona was sitting on a hassock in the living room watching Sheriff Bud, who today was wearing sideburns. While Beezus got out the checker set, Henry watched the program. "And I want all you little folks out in TV land to do something for old Sheriff Bud," the sheriff was saying. "I want you to tell your mother right now, right this very minute, to put crispy potato chips, the potato chips guaranteed to never bend, on her shopping list. Yes, sirree, this very minute." His smile filled up the whole screen. "Mother," called Ramona, "Sheriff Bud says—" "I don't care what Sheriff Bud says," answered Mrs. Quimby from the kitchen. She sounded very cross. "I can make out my own grocery list without that man's help." Beezus set up the checkerboard on the coffee table and, kneeling, she and Henry began to play. For once, Ramona did not bother them, but Henry found it difficult to think about the game and try to follow Sheriff Bud at the same time. They both stopped playing whenever a cartoon came on, but Beezus had no trouble beating him twice in succession. Once, when the sheriff waved a sheaf of letters, Henry's hopes rose, but Sheriff Bud only wished a lot of people happy birthday and told how many people had written to say they liked the nutsies, the candy bar chock full of energy. Henry wished he had his letter, that both he and Ramona ate nutsies. Henry wished he had said in his letter that both he and Ramona ate nutsies all the time, and crispy potato chips too. By the time the program ended, Beezus had defeated Henry a third time. Naturally, Henry could not let this record stand. "I bet I can beat you tomorrow," he volunteered. "I bet you can't," said Beezus. "But you can come over and try." Henry left, and by working fast, delivered all his papers on time. The next afternoon, he once more presented himself at the Quimby's front door, this time to show Beezus he really could beat her at checkers. He would forget all about Sheriff Bud. It had been silly of him to think his letter would be read out of all the thousands the television station received. Beezus had the checkers waiting on the coffee table, and, as usual, Ramona was sitting on the hassock watching Sheriff Bud, who was wearing a pair of large false ears. His voice filled the living room. "Ramona, turn that program down," shouted Mrs. Quimby from the kitchen. Ramona did not budge. This time, Henry was determined to ignore even the cartoons. Beezus made the first move with a red checker, and Henry moved the black checker. Beezus jumped on him, and he jumped on her. The game was on. "And now, kiddies, out there in TV land, if Mother doesn't have a cupboard full of—" Sheriff Bud was saying. Mrs. Quimby appeared in the living room. "Ramona, turn that thing off. I am sick and tired of listening to that man tell me what to buy." "No!" screamed Ramona. "No, I don't want to turn it off." "Then turn it down," said Mrs. Quimby, and went back into the kitchen. This time, Ramona lowered the sound of the television set slightly. Your move, Beezus reminded Henry. Henry studied the board. If he moved there, Beezus could jump on him. If he moved there, he could jump on her if she moved her man in the right direction. And now for today's mail, announced Sheriff Bud. Henry could not help glancing at the television screen. Sheriff Bud was holding the usual handful of letters, but this time he was pointing straight ahead at someone in the television audience. Ramona Geraldine Quimby, I see you out there, he said. I see you in TV land. Henry and Beezus dropped their checkers. Mrs. Quimby stepped out of the kitchen. Ramona clasped her hands together and her eyes grew round. He sees me, she said in awe. Ramona Geraldine Quimby, said Sheriff Bud. I want you to do something that will make old Sheriff Bud very, very happy. Whatever it is, I am not going to buy it, Mrs. Quimby sounded indignant. Ramona leaned forward. Her eyes were wide and her mouth was open. Henry's eyes were just about as wide and his mouth was open too. Sheriff Bud sounded as if he and Ramona were alone. Ramona, it will make Sheriff Bud very, very happy if you stop pestering. And he stopped and squinted at the letter in his hands. Henry Huggins on his paper route. Do you promise? Yes, Ramona barely whispered. Good, said Sheriff Bud. We've got to get those papers delivered. If you stop pestering Henry on his paper route, you will make me just about as happy as if you told your mother you wanted crispy potato chips for lunch every day. And now... But no one was listening to the television set. Henry! Shrieked Beezus. Did you hear that? I sure did. Henry was feeling a little in awe himself. It had seemed as if Sheriff Bud really could see Ramona. He could not, of course, but... Honestly... Mrs. Quimby snapped off the television set. That man will do anything to squeeze in more commercials. Ugh, crispy potato chips, really. Only Ramona was silent. That's funny, because Ramona is never silent. She did not even object to her mother's turning off the television set. She turned to Henry with her eyes wide in awe. Do you really know Sheriff Bud? She asked. Well, I guess you might say he's a friend of mine, said Henry, and added to himself, now. Then Mrs. Quimby spoke to her youngest daughter. Ramona, have you been pestering Henry on his paper route again? Ramona looked as if she were about to cry. I won't do it anymore, she said. That's a good girl, said Mrs. Quimby. Delivering papers is an important job, and you mustn't get in Henry's way. I bet I know how Sheriff Bud knew about it, said Beezus with a smile. Your move, Henry. Henry grinned as he advanced his checker. Beezus promptly jumped and captured 2 of his men. Oh well, what did he care? It was only a game. His paper route was real. Henry grimaced at Ramona, who smiled back almost shyly. Henry moved another checker, which Beezus captured. He did not care. His paper route was safe from Ramona, and if she pestered him again, all he had to do was say, "Remember Sheriff Bud," and his troubles would be over. It was as easy as that. He'd finally hit upon a good idea that had nothing wrong with it. Not one single thing. And that's a surprise too, isn't it? Because Henry's a bit of a mess. I won! Beezus was triumphant. I'll beat you at the next game, said Henry. And this time, he was sure he would.